Christina Rice. Christina, you're going to talk about Ann Dvorak. Christina, I'm going to embarrass you and tell people lots of nice things about you for a couple minutes. Okay, if people are interested in hearing more about the narrative and the saga of your writing this book, I believe Lisa Napoli did an interview with you on Which Way LA recently about your experience of using the Metro as a time-saving device and an efficiency tool for writing. And everyone, Christina's the best. She's really wonderful woman. You are, in your professional life, you are the senior librarian for the photo collection of the Los Angeles Public Library?
That's right.
Okay, good. So if you're interested in old Los Angeles, the photo collection is a good place to start. If you're looking for interesting, obscure photos, shooting her an email. You sometimes have stuff scanned that's not available. That hasn't been pushed yet. So if you really have some serious research questions,
that you can't find.
Yeah, serious research inquiries, email Christina for serious research inquiries. Do you want to just spend a second and talk about Photo Friends?
So I oversee the photo collection at the Los Angeles Public Library. If you've never done so, you can go to the LAPL website, and I think we're closing in on 100,000 photos that we've digitized. 350 to 500 go online every month, so I welcome you to go and lose a few hours of your life searching it. I'm lucky enough to have a friends group, Photo Friends, who sponsors the photo collection and the history and genealogy department. You can go to photofriends.org to get a bit more information. I encourage you to become a member. If you love the mid-century era and the San Fernando Valley, go to valleytimes.org to find out all about our Valley Times project. And they do lots and lots of programming. So if you sign up for the email list, you'll be alerted of a lot of programming going on, including, I have a postcard over there. We're actually going to be screening one of Ann's films on December 7th, and I'll be doing a lecture, a really brief introduction to pre-code, and that's sponsored by Photo Friends and the Literature and Fiction Department.
That's very good. Jeff, would you please raise your hand? Jeff, you are selling Christina's book.
I am.
Okay, and you are also the proprietor of Larry Edmonds Bookshop, which is a very important bookshop in the history of Los Angeles culture. You are on you're on Hollywood Boulevard in Cherokee, and you do a lot of events. So I will leave people. Do you have flyers here for your events?
I have all my contact information. Anybody wants to get on our mailing list?
Everyone should at least get on his mailing list before you leave, if you're not. They do fundamental work. Stacy Keach, a couple weeks ago, Stacy Keach, my hero. Good job. All right, so let's get started. So Christina, tell us everything.
Thank you, Richard. First up, I want to thank Kim and Richard for inviting me to speak today. This is, I've talked about Ann a lot over the last 16 or so years, but I've never done it formally. So this is the first official Ann Dvorak talk. So thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank Kim and Richard for, I've known them for a number of years, and they've been really big cheerleaders of mine on this project, and I really do appreciate it. And Richard walked out, but I wanted to thank him. He introduced me to the Scrivener writing software, which I ended up writing a book on, so thank you. I feel like I'm forever indebted to you.
Everyone use Scrivener.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. And so now,
glad it works.
It works great.
Yeah.
Yes, it did. Thank you. So now, on to Ann. So when it comes to Ann, and in my house, she's just known as Ann, there are two questions that I've been asked the most over the last decade plus. And the first question is, how do you pronounce that last name? And first off, that really wasn't her last name. It was a stage name. Her real name was Anna McKim. And when she adopted it, she wanted it to be pronounced Dvorak. And I think she alleged it was a name on her mom's side of the family. Her mom's side was Czech. I think she actually just lifted it from the composer because she thought it sounded classy. So she wanted to be called Ann Dvorak. However, nobody did that. Very quickly, everybody called her Ann Dvorak, and pretty early on, she conceded defeat, and so now she's just known as Ann Dvorak. And even though she wanted to be called Ann Dvorak, and even though I guess you could say I'm her biggest fan, I just can't bring myself to call her Ann Dvorak. It just sounds so pretentious, so I'm sorry, Ann. I can't do it. I've got a lot of mileage out of this photo. So the second question I get asked, and probably the question I do get asked more than any other question, is why? Why Ann Dvorak? Why would you undertake this massive project to write a book about Ann? And so I'm going to tell you why. I've been a classic movie fan as far back as I can remember. Why, I don't know. I just always have been. And I think my first long-term life goal I ever set for myself was to be able to identify all of the figures at Movieland Wax Museum in Buena Park. I think most kids would have been really creeped out. I was fascinated and frustrated that I didn't know who these people were. So I'm happy to say I did achieve that goal, that life goal, before they closed in 2005. And so once I got into college and I had, a very small bank account and a driver's license and a car and a video rental card and my library card, I just aggressively watched as many classic films as I could, especially during the summer. I usually didn't take summer school, I wasn't that ambitious. And so my summers were just spent obsessively watching classic movies. And I would usually focus on one particular actor and just say, oh, Bette Davis. And I would go out and try to watch as many Bette Davis movies as I could. And then I would go out and I would try to read as many books as I could. And I did that with Rita Hayworth and Errol Flynn and the Marx Brothers. And all of these people, I could find their movies. They had at least one, if not multiple books written about them. And if I really liked them, if I thought they really made the cut, then I would get in my car. I lived in my hometown of Glendora, over in the San Gabriel Valley, and I would drive down to Hollywood to a shop called Cinema Collectors, which was I think on Wilcox off of Sunset. And they had these great black and white 8x10 reproduction photos that I think were $3. And so I really liked someone. I would go and splurge and spend like $30, which was major, major money to a college student. And so sometime, I think it was around 1995, 96, I was at the Glendora Public Library, and I came across a movie called 3 on a Match. And here's the VHS tape that I checked out from the Glendora Public Library. And I was kind of moderately aware of pre-code cinema, but it had that label of Forbidden Hollywood. And the description, reading the description now, is not that great of a description, but for some reason in 1995, I thought it just sounded fascinating, it sounded lurid, and it had Bette Davis and Humphrey Bogart. It was 1932, so I thought, okay, it's only an hour long. I thought, okay, I'm just gonna watch this really cool, quick film with a young Bette Davis, and then I'll just move on to the next thing. And instead, there was Ann Dvorak. And I didn't know who she was at the time. And in that 63 minutes, I watched her go from this, snazzy, high society wife and mother to somebody who instead decides to throw it all over for hot sex with Lyle Talbot. I don't know if and turns into just this bedraggled, pathetic drug addict. And I was amazed. Like, I had never been so blindsided by a performance in my life. And it was so amazing that when the movie ended, my mom actually walked through the door right as the movie ended, and I said, Mom, sit down. And I hit the rewind button on my VCR, and I watched it again, back to back. And I was just absolutely amazed. And then probably, within a few months, I just happened to watch Scarface, the original Howard Hawks Scarface with Paul Muni, 1932, and G-Men with James Cagney. And there she was. And I didn't watch these movies because she was in them, but there she was again. And again, just stunned by this incredibly talented, beautiful actress. And the question I had was why? Why didn't I know who she was? Why didn't, how come everybody didn't know who she was? She was fantastic. And so I went, so I decided Ann was worthy. Ann was worthy of my actor ritual. And so I went to the video rental store and did not find any more of her movies. I went to my library, no more of her movies. I actually went to my college library, and at the time I had an extreme aversion to librarians because I had been completely traumatized by my elementary school librarian and had avoided them ever since. And I so wanted to know about Ann that I actually made myself go talk to the librarian at my university and said, I need a book on Ann Dvorak. And she said, oh yeah, I think that there's this book called Queen of the Bees. It turned out that was about Ida Lupino. There wasn't a book on Ann Dvorak. I thought at the time, I legitimately thought every single actor who made movies, somebody had written a book on. But Ann, there was nothing. And finally, my last ditch to satiate my appetite for Ann, I went to Cinema Collectors and asked for their file on Ann Dvorak and got a blank stare. And no photos of her. So at that point, I gave up on him, and I just kind of put her on the back burner. And a year or two later, I was majoring in film, and I did an internship at a talent agency in Beverly Hills. And the assistant who I reported to, it turned out, was a classic film buff like I had never met before. I thought I knew a few things about movies. I knew nothing. Like, this guy could watch a movie for 5 seconds and tell you what studio made it. I've never met anybody like him. And when he interviewed me for my internship, there we go.
Sorry.
That's okay. When he interviewed me, he's asking me all of these questions, and then he asked me what I wanted to do with my life. And at the time, I was considering film preservation. I said, maybe film preservation because I love old movies. And I remember him looking down, and he says, oh, I love old movies too. Do you want the job? And I thought, God, that was the easiest interview I have ever had for a job. And it turned out it was because I said I loved old movies. And as we were working together, I just realized I knew nothing compared to him, and I felt like a hack. I felt like an old movie hack compared to Darren, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. I think he's ill. And so in a desperate attempt to impress him, I said, oh, well, you know who I like, and I just can't find anything on, is Ann Dvorak. And it impressed him. So this was in 1997. We are still friends because I uttered the words Ann Dvorak. And Darren was not only a classic movie buff, he also collected vintage movie posters, which was, like, to me, the coolest thing in the world, because I always thought it would be nice to own, like, theater-used movie posters. But the only time you ever hear about them in the mainstream media is when something sells for like $500,000 at auction. So I assumed all movie posters sold for tens of thousands of dollars. And he collected on Norma Shearer, which again, I thought, wow, who collects on Norma Shearer? That is amazing. And anybody who's been collecting movie memorabilia long enough, you end up with a pile of stuff you don't actually collect on. And so the next time I worked with him, after I told him how much I loved Ann, he walks into the office and he hands me this photo. This photo of Ann and Warren William from 3 on a Match. And I was amazed. And then coincidentally, or because the stars were in alignment, I think within a few weeks, shockingly, Turner Classic Movies did a tribute to Ann and showed a bunch of her films. And Darren was such the movie buff, he always had a tape in the VCR, always ready to record. So he recorded all of these Ann movies, and he brought them to the office. And so during our lunch break, or we would even actually stay after work after the agents went home, we would just have Ann Dvorak Theater in the screening room. And we just spent all this time watching these Ann movies, which weren't always good, but they still had Ann, and we just bonded. And so we became indignant when she had to wear a bad blonde wig and a strange love of Molly Louvain. We both shrieked out loud when she walked on screen in this dress in Midnight Court, which to me looks like somebody skinned a fish and put it on Ann. And incidentally, I think this is the first still I ever bought from Larry Edmonds, was this one here. So I bought many. And then we both sat in awe watching her just wipe up the screen with Lana Turner in A Life of Her Own. And we really bonded on it over watching these Ann Dvorak movies. And then Darren started taking me around town to the movie memorabilia shops. In 1997, there were actually still a lot of shops around town, and so he took me to a place called the Hollywood Poster Exchange, which was at the corner of Santa Monica and La Cienega. And I bought a lobby card, like an actual theater-used 1937 lobby card from Racing Lady with Ann on it. It was $15, which I thought was kind of a lot, but I could afford it. And that's when it clicked. Wow, Ann Dvorak was somebody who I loved, and unlike the Marx Brothers, I could actually afford to collect movie memorabilia on her. And if you talk to anybody who's known me long enough, I have been a compulsive collector since I was a small child. My family has always made fun of me. I have so many collections of things, but vintage movie posters, Ann Dvorak, I was sunk. The other place Darren took me was the Margaret Herrick Library, which is the Motion Picture Academy's library. And they actually had a clipping file on Ann. And so going through the clipping file, I started to find out a little bit more about her. So I found out that when she was just shy of 20 was when she got cast in Scarface. And that it was actually her first credited film as Ann Dvorak. And that it was such a big hit that she was being touted by the press as Hollywood's new Cinderella. I learned that she had 3 husbands over the course of her life, and we have Leslie Fenton here in the corner, the brown derby, and here she is marrying Igor Dega with lots of hair at her home in Brentwood. I learned that during the war, she was in England and she drove an ambulance. Like, who does that? I'm sure lots of women in London did. How many Americans went and did that? And then finally I learned that she died in 1979, so I couldn't go find her, and that she had retired to Hawaii and had spent 20 years there. And these little pieces just fascinated me, and I realized that nobody was gonna write a book on Ann Dvorak, so why shouldn't I? So I was in my early 20s, incredibly naive, but I remember marching in. I worked at a grocery store at the time, and I remember marching into the grocery store and saying, I am going to write a book on Ann Dvorak. And I was going to write a book because at the age of 23 or 24, I had the key, I had the research key, which was the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. And I was very impressed with that. So I went out and I bought a spiral notebook, and I went to the Glendora Public Library, kind of where it all began, and I was going to fill this notebook with all of these articles and treasures that I was going to find in these books, and it was just going to get me started on my research. And so I went eagerly, and I found 2 things. I found her 1979 obituary from Time magazine, and I found some article from Better Homes and Gardens in 1946 called Ann Dvorak Lives Simply. And so the research, I guess she did. And so the research actually, I was Ann Dvorak's biographer, the research kind of stopped there. I didn't know what to do. Like, this was 1997, 98. The internet was around, but it really wasn't a research tool yet. So I didn't know really what to do, so I did what I did best, and that was I just started collecting. And again, it was a great time. This was the early days of eBay, so you still had a lot of shops all around town. Nobody had collected on Ann, so I had free reign. I walked into every store. Everybody had something. You had eBay, things coming up that I might not have access to otherwise. There used to be this great Hollywood collector show at the Beverly Garland Holiday Inn. It was every 3 months. It was 5 rooms of memorabilia, and there was always new dealers. And I like the night before, I couldn't sleep. It was like Christmas to me to go to this convention. And I always found something. And it got to the point where, my friend and I, Darren, we would walk into these shows and people would just look at us like, oh, it's Ann Dvorak and Norm Shear. And we're like, hey, cool, that's fine. As long as you have something, that is fine. So my first 5 years as Ann Dvorak's biographer was pretty much spent collecting and collecting and collecting and collecting and collecting and collecting. And as my husband can attest, I have a pretty decent Ann Dvorak collection now of at least 1,500 photos and over 100 posters and many, many things. So finally around 2002, a few things happened. Number one, I had enrolled in graduate school to become a librarian. And so I started to understand research at that point. I started to understand kind of what I really needed to do beyond the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. The internet started to become a research source, not only because things were being digitized, but it was also easier to figure out where things were. I went to USC's Warner Brothers archives, and I was with Warner Brothers for 5 years, and so being able to see these primary source documents about Ann and about her time at Warner Brothers, and to try to understand why her career maybe didn't go as far as it should have been, was fascinating and exhilarating. And I also launched AnnDvorak.com. On front page, I designed it myself. I was so proud. It looked so terrible. When I first met my husband, the first thing he did was redesign my website for me. So these things all kind of started opening the research floodgates. And it took another 10 years. So from 2002 to 2012, it was just hardcore research the entire time. But at the end of it all, I was finally able to really piece together Ann's story. And I found out that she was the daughter of performers. Her father, Edwin McKim, he could have been big in Pittsburgh government, but instead became an actor. He performed in the legitimate theater. He later went into vaudeville, and then he started working in films as a director and a scenario writer. Her mom, Anna Lair, who was 20 years younger than her dad, was also a vaudeville performer, and was so devoted to her craft that she was 8 months pregnant with Ann and performing on the stage. And got good notices too. She said she looked lovely. I guess pregnancy agreed with her. I learned that Ann had worshipped her mother. Anna Blair at one point decided to devote more time to her film career in Los Angeles and New York than to motherhood, so she left Anne first at a convent school in New York and then with relatives. And sometimes during that period of separation, the only time Anne saw her mother was to go to the movies and see her mom on the big screen, where her and a cousin would giggle when Anna Blair came on the screen and people would shush them. But there was her mom, larger than life, who she absolutely came to idolize, even though there were periods of separation. Her father, on the other hand, her parents got divorced when Anne was really young, and he was missing from most of her childhood until she became an adult. And once she became a star, she was able to use the press to be reunited with him, and this is her meeting him at the train station in Pasadena in 1934. I learned that Anne was also in movies as a child. So these are two of the three things she did. Ramona, she was in the 1915 epic Ramona, and then something called The Man-Hater, which was a comedy. I don't know how that's a comedy, but apparently it was. Her film career was short-lived, though, and as she became an adolescent, her mother finally decided to focus on motherhood and married an ad exec. And so Anne ended up relocating to Los Angeles, where she became obsessed with the movies. She lived in the city that had become the movie capital of the world. There was that influence of her mother, and so she wanted to be either a writer or she wanted to be an actress, and she would drill her mother about all aspects of the movie industry. Her mother, on the other hand, didn't think Anne was pretty or polished enough to ever be in films, so she really didn't encourage her daughter to pursue that. But Anne was tenacious, and so she did. And she, by the skin of her teeth, got into the chorus line at MGM for the Hollywood Review of 1929. She also liked to go to the beach a lot, which is why she is so much tanner in this picture. You can see her. She's the real tan girl right there, looking at Busby Berkeley. And so she became a chorus girl at MGM, and she turned out to be such a good teacher that Sammy Lee, who was the main choreographer at MGM, brought her on as his assistant choreographer, where she taught, amongst other people, Joan Crawford. She taught her dance routines. She became really good friends with Joan Crawford, and Joan desperately tried to help Anne, break out beyond the chorus. And Anne just couldn't. As much as Joan tried to help her as much as she wanted to, she just kind of languished in chorus jobs, or she'd sometimes get a job as an extra. And finally, another friend of hers at the MGM studio, an actress named Karen Morley, landed a role in the gangster film Scarface. And so she knew that there was another lead role they were trying to fill, so she introduced Anne to Howard Hawks at a party, and Anne dazzled him enough that she got a screen test. And within weeks, she was transformed from this to that. So these pictures were actually taken the same year, and she was transformed into Jessica Camonte for Scarface. Howard Hughes, who produced Scarface, thought she was fantastic, signed her to a contract. Warner Brothers, in turn, thought she was fantastic, started borrowing her exclusively from Howard Hughes. She was Hollywood's new Cinderella. It was the pre-code era. It was the time of daring women's roles, and Anne was shooting up. And she looked like she was going to reach the highest heights. And then Anne, she fell in love with her co-star Leslie Fenton on The Strange Love of Molly Louvain. And Leslie Fenton was a fellow actor, and he viewed Hollywood as a way to finance his trips to Europe. So he would work, make some money, take off until he was broke again, and then he would come back and make a few more movies. Anne fell head over heels in love with Leslie Fenton. She was 20 years old when that happened, and she only knew him a few weeks before she married him. They eloped to Yuma, Arizona, and within a couple of months, he convinced her to walk out on her contract to go to Europe. So she was tired, she was exhausted, she was overwhelmed, she was a young woman in love. So they got on a boat, took the Panama Canal to New York, and they were going to go on this wonderful honeymoon. But before they got to Europe, they stopped off in New York. This is them in New York. And when they got off the boat, they complained about Anne's salary. They complained about the slave drivers of that Hollywood producers were. I mean, she badmouthed her bosses, which maybe she shouldn't have done. Howard Hughes sold her up the river because he had sold his contract. He had sold her contract to Warner Brothers for $40,000. So Warner Brothers was holding this $40,000 contract, and there was no Anne. But she went, and she had this wonderful honeymoon. These are actually photos from her honeymoon scrapbook, which I'll talk about. Fenton actually had a job making a movie in Germany, FP1, And they were gone for 8 months. And it was an amazing experience, it really was. Ann thought it helped her acting. I don't think Warner Brothers agreed. But after 8 months, she came back. Warner Brothers was actually pretty generous with her. I mean, they paid 40 grand for her contract, which was actually 10 grand more than what MGM paid for Jean Harlow's contract from Howard Hughes. So Ann was more of a commodity than Jean Harlow was in 1932. She came back and they put her to work, and they worked her a lot. I think she made at least 10 movies in 1934. Not always quality, but the quantity was there, so Ann was definitely working. Finally, she started getting fed up with the roles. She also started getting some kind of, she became mysteriously ill, and they put her on a suspension that lasted longer than she thought it would. So just when her career seemed to be gaining momentum again, she took Warner Brothers to court. So in 1936, two other Warner Brothers players, Bette Davis and James Cagney, also took Warner Brothers to court, and they get talked about a lot. Their court cases get brought up. Ann filed her lawsuit before either one of them. So Ann, I like to think Ann paved the way for Cagney and Bette Davis to follow her lead. Her suit was unsuccessful, that the judge didn't agree with her assertion that they had no right to suspend her for illness. So she lost the court case, probably damaged her reputation a bit with the other studios around town, and Warner Brothers canceled her contract. They kind of, I think Jack Warner wanted to make his point, so he held on to her until she lost the court case, and then put her in that fish dress in midnight court, and then canceled her contract. So she then went on, and she became a freelancer, which I love, is one of my favorite photos, because Ann was a very serious person, so she seldom looked like this. So she started a freelance career, and this was in 1937, at a time when most actors really wanted the security of studio contracts, so she freelanced for a while. I also discovered why she halted her career again and went to England during the war. It was because Leslie Fenton was a British citizen, and he, in 1940, enrolled in the Royal Navy, and he left, and Ann could not bear to be away from him. So she did whatever she could to get passage to London. And she went in December of 1940, traveled on a boat through hostile waters with mines, had to go to Lisbon, was stranded, didn't know how long she was going to be stranded in Lisbon. She ended up staying there for a month until she finally was able to fly into London during the Blitz to be near Leslie Fenton. And while she was there, as I said, she did drive an ambulance. Here she is in her uniform. She also worked for the Women's Land Army. She broadcasted on the BBC. He was wounded, and she made movies there too. And then she also did road shows. She did like USO shows with B.B. Daniels. And they traveled around, they visited hospitals. Here she is in Ireland, visiting a wounded soldier. So she did a lot during the war, and went there, a full year before the United States was even involved in the conflict. In 1943, Leslie Fenton was honorably discharged because he got injured at the Battle of St. Nazaire, and they came back. And as it turned out, the biggest casualty of the war for Ann was her marriage. And she divorced Leslie Fenton in 1946. Following that, she tried her hand at Broadway. Here she is on stage in The Respectful Prostitute that aired at the Court Theater. And then I found out that after that, she went on, she continued to work until 1951. Mainly in supporting parts, and here she is on the set of A Life of Her Own with Lana Turner and George Cukor. So, despite walking out on her contract, she did work for another 20 years. Maybe the films weren't always great, but she did them. I think she has around 53 or 54 credited roles. So in addition to her career, I also found out about Ann off the movie screen. And Ann wasn't just a pretty face. Ann had a very active mind and many hobbies. Bacteriology was a hobby of hers. And I like to think she honestly practiced bacteriology in full hair and makeup. Millinery, she made her own hats. Here she is at a hat show with Ann Baxter and Hedy Lamarr. Ann loved to write from a very young age. It was a toss-up between being a writer and being an actress. She loved to write. She wrote a lot of poetry. She was always supposedly she was going to write about her honeymoon travels. She was going to write about her war travels. None of this really came to pass. Although she did write some articles during the war. In the 60s, she wrote an 18-volume history of the world and then made an audiobook out of it, which she was going to market to universities as a teaching aid. And sadly, none of the universities went for it, and I don't know and she called it Historical Digest, and she even had letterhead made, and I don't know if Ann Dvorak's 18-volume abridged history of the world is magnificent or truly awful. I have no idea, because I don't think it still exists. She collected books. She collected like rare books and manuscripts and had early copies of like early thesaurus and just collected massive amounts of materials that way. And she also had a tremendous green thumb. This is here at her her Encino Ranch house where she had built a greenhouse. She had an amazing green thumb, which I think is one of the reasons why she wanted to move to Hawaii, because of all of the greenery there. And people I talked to who had known her in Hawaii said there were just plants everywhere. I also was able to piece together what happened after she retired. So she retired in 1951, and she ultimately moved to Hawaii in 1959 with her third husband, Nicholas Wade. So I was able to piece together that, the time in Hawaii wasn't great. That third husband, kind of a monster. She became estranged from her mother, although they finally reconciled in the late 60s, and here she is with her mom, Anna Lair, in 1969 in Hawaii. When her mom was diagnosed with cancer in 1974, Anne flew back to Santa Monica to take care of her. So even though her and her mom had a rough patch, she was able to take care of her at the end. And then I also had to figure out what happened to me. This is Anne 5 months before she died. One of the things I found out early on is people who knew about her would sometimes say, oh, I heard she died in absolute poverty. And it was because there was a National Enquirer article that was published after she died. And so that was one of the things I had to do was to figure out how accurate this National Enquirer article was. And I think with any Enquirer article, there's a basis of truth and then a lot of exaggeration, which I think was the case. She was pretty broke. That last husband, kind of awful again, spent her money. She was on a fixed income. She's probably getting government assistance. She should have been way better off for somebody who one time was making $2,500 a week, but I think she still had that incredibly active mind. I found evidence that she had concocted some solution to help cotton farmers that she was trying to sell to some company that didn't go through. She was also trying to fashion herself as an armchair critic and was going to put an ad in the Hollywood Reporter offering her services. I think she was going to go interview people on Hawaii Five-0 while she was living there. So she was still very active. So she wasn't just sitting around waiting to die. But the circumstances she was in wasn't great. But she was still vibrant. She was still Anne. And so she died in December of 1979 from stomach cancer. She was 68. I think she looks a little bit older than 68. So I was able to finally piece together Ann Dvorak's life, and I think I got a pretty full picture of her. And I think anybody who dives into a project like this and writes a biography of someone's life, you can't help but have it become an incredibly personal experience in a way, and to develop this really weird personal relationship with the person, who in my case was somebody who was deceased and who I never met. But it did become a personal relationship, and not just because I got married at her house, but I did. Something people ask me is that, I must identify with her tremendously. And I don't know that I ever really identified with Anne. I don't think we had a lot in common. We both love history, but I don't think we had a lot in common. But I respected her tremendously. I came to care about her tremendously. The gentleman who owned her house at the time, he had actually corresponded with her. And so the first time I met him, he handed me a stack of letters she had written him in the 60s, which for me was it's just amazing to have a document like that. And I started looking through the documents, and it became clear that these letters were written at a bad time in her life, and that she wasn't particularly sober when she wrote most of the letters. And my first reaction was, oh my gosh, I can't do that to her. I can't bring these letters out to the world. I can't let people see this side of her, because I felt that protective of her. But of course, as her biographer, I had to. And then here's my daughter at what we call Ann Land, and she's back there. So anybody who thought, who's the dope who brought a kid to this thing, it's me. I'm the dope that brought the kid to this thing. And Anne, I feel like, I like to think I did a lot for Anne in bringing her story out and kind of explaining the why of why she did become a bigger star, which I think can really be attributed to that walkout and the honeymoon, the 8-month honeymoon. Which I always blamed Leslie Fenton for, and I was always kind of mad at Anne for doing that to her career.
I'm furious.
I hated him for years. And then when my daughter was about a year old, I got diagnosed with thyroid cancer, which it was early on, so I don't think I was ever in too much imminent danger. But I did have to do a round of iodine radiation, which consists of popping a pill, no side effects other than I'm emitting massive amounts of radiation and can't be around people, especially small children. So I had to be quarantined at my mother's house for a week. And my savior during this period, during a week separation from my daughter and my husband, was Ann Dvorak. That I was able to focus on that I was able to write about that. And the part I was actually writing on while I was quarantined was about her courtship with Leslie Fenton and about the walkout and the honeymoon. And I'm writing this while I'm separated from the two people that mean the most to me. And at that point, I got it. I got it. I don't think she should have complained to the press about her salary. I think that was a really stupid move. But I understand why she did it. You have, 20 years old, you have this opportunity to travel the world with somebody who you're madly in love with. I get it. She suffered for it, but I totally got it. And I'm not, and I do have to mention, I think the hardest part about the Ann Dvorak biography was the writing. I'm a librarian. I can research till the cows come home. Ask me a reference question, and I would be slobbering all over you. Yes, let me help you. But the writing actually was a little bit grueling, and I started writing a couple of years before my daughter was born, and was really kind of slogging my way through it. And once my daughter Gable was born, I didn't name her Anne, that's too obvious. Once Gable was born, I realized that I'd been wasting an inordinate amount of time. All that time I hemmed and hawed about writing, I should have just been writing. And so that's when I figured out my only time of the day after the birth of my daughter was writing on the train. So that's how I pretty much wrote the bulk of the book on my 22-minute train ride from North Hollywood to downtown. Most of it was written there. And so getting back to Anne, so I'm not one that I don't believe in the afterlife and spirits and all that, but sometimes I did. Sometimes I felt like Anne was playing a part, in her story, and sometimes I felt like she was really screwing with me too. I was able to track down this antique dealer in Hawaii that got the contents of her storage unit. And so me and my mom drove, it was 2003, and so we drove to the North Shore, and most of the items that this guy had in the storage unit had been destroyed, but he had a handful of photos, including 3 portraits taken by George Hurrell. And George Hurrell was just the preeminent glamour photographer. And at the time, I didn't even know he had shot Anne. So it turns out she had gone to him after she became a freelancer. So this was one of them. And this dealer, he'd been sitting on this stuff for over 20 years, 30 years, and he wanted $350 for it. So Anne might guide me to these photos from her storage unit, but she was going to just give me the most cantankerous old fart that I had to haggle with. He wanted $350 a photo. I was still in graduate school, so I'm begging him to lower the price. My the guy's wife is begging him. He's like, come on, so he lowered the price to $150, and I was able to buy a couple of them. You'll notice I didn't show you any pictures of Nicholas Wade, Anne's third husband. I couldn't find any. By the time she married him, she was kind of out of the spotlight, so the press didn't take photos. A niece of his, in January of this year, I was reaching my deadline, so she just threw them in the mail, and they never showed up. So there's no photos of him, and I think, and I said that the guy was pretty awful. So I think maybe Anne just didn't want his face to be shown in the book. So those photos have never shown up. And then, after after I had finished the manuscript, I turned it into the University Press of Kentucky, my publisher, who's wonderful. 3 weeks after I turned in my final manuscript, I get contacted by this mysterious person in Reno. And they just leave a comment on my Ann Dvorak website saying, yeah, I have a bunch of Ann's stuff, great stuff, found it by the trash. What? I contact this person, the most difficult person on the face of the planet. And she had Ann's stuff. She wasn't really forthcoming with it, but she had Ann's stuff. And she was so difficult, I had to turn her over to my friend Darren. Getting back to Darren, he's been around the whole time. We've become the best of friends. He became an agent in his own right. So I turned it over to my friend, the agent, to deal with her. I'm like, dude, I can't deal with her. She's too difficult. So 2 months of haggling, and I finally got the box of her stuff. And included in that box was her scrapbook of honeymoon photos that had been sitting in the trunk of this woman in Reno. Hundreds of photos of that 1932 honeymoon that, yeah, torpedoed her career, but in the end it was one of the few possessions Anne still had. And I also had, there were canceled checks, there was a journal with one lone entry from 1977 where Anne sums up her life and career, which makes it the end of the book. So, you know, and it came, it's so late in the game, and it came on this box of stuff came on the day my final copy edit approvals were due. And I contacted my copy editor and I said, I got a really weird situation. You know, tomorrow I might be getting this FedEx box with all this stuff. And I don't know if there's going to be time to alter it. And she said, no, there's time, and this is great, write a preface. So that's where the preface came. I'm so glad that the preface is there. Because I was also able to say why there's no photos of that third husband. And my publisher was great. They let me swap out photos, so there's photos from the honeymoon scrapbook. So it wasn't easy, you know. Anne let me have this stuff, but again, she just, you know, she just had to mess with me and just do it like in the 11th hour. And those contents that I got actually really altered the end of the book as well. So, you know, it took 15 years for the book to finally come out, but I honestly think it took as long as it needed to take, and I think it's about as perfect as it could possibly be, other than those photos of the third husband that are lost in the mail somewhere. But after 15 years, it's here, it's over there, and I really couldn't be more proud of it.
Question?
Nathan.
Are there any,
Are there any instant hats by Anne?
Not that I know of, but Warner Brothers never got rid of their wardrobe. Like, their wardrobe is still there, so I'm hoping that fish dress is somewhere. If any of you know, have a connection to the Warner Brothers costume department, I want the fish dress, but the hats, I don't think so. Any other questions? Yes?
So, what's your next project? There must be somebody else that you're interested in?
My next project, I think, is going to be something without endnotes. I want something easy. I'm not sure if I'm ready to take on another biography yet, so I'm going to just promote the snot out of this thing, and maybe we'll see what happens.
We'll be waiting.
Thank you.
A question.
Yes.
Did you get a sense of whether or not Anne wanted children?
You know, I don't think she did. The only quote I ever found about her wanting to have children was like in the most clinical sense, like, yeah, I think I should have a kid because I don't want to miss any of, you know, life's experiences. But yeah, I don't get the sense that she was particularly maternal, so I don't think she did.
Was she an only child?
She was an only child.
Only children do not have children, and if they have a child, they almost always have only one.
One child. Gable, don't listen. You still want to have kids someday. Any other questions? Yes.
In the Warner Brothers archives, did you find any notes of her arguments with Jack Warner?
Yes. Oh, yeah. But the Warner Brothers archive was just an absolute treasure trove, and it really was. Like, it documented the behind the scenes, what was going on. One of my favorite documents in the archive was when she returned from England. You know, word got around to Jack Warner that Anne was back in town, and he sent out a memo to some of his supervisors, and the memo said something along the line of, you know, if Ann Dvorak shows up at the studio, give her her dressing room, be nice to her, treat her like nothing happened. But the second she asks about her salary or her contract, send her to me. That was one of my favorite. So yeah, lots of memos back and forth. What do we do with her? And yeah, and Jack Warner, when he wrote his autobiography in the '60s, you know, he doesn't acknowledge the existence of his own kid or Hal Wallace, his producer. He gives a couple of paragraphs to Anne, and he does talk about it with some regret. You know, I think he really liked her, and I think she had a lot of potential, but she screwed him. So he wasn't going to let it slide, unfortunately. He couldn't get past it. But I think he did have a tremendous amount of respect for her as an actress. And she actually made a Warner Brothers movie during the war. So it was overseas, and she corresponded with him during the war. But, you know, the damage had long been done by that point. But yeah, that's my advice. If you want to write a biography on someone, pick somebody who was at Warner Brothers, because that Warner Brothers archive at USC is just outstanding. So, any other questions? Great, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank Christina again. This is very good. You're going to be over there. If you want to buy a book, you're going to sign it. Jeff, you're ready? Good. Okay. Go buy her book. Go talk to her. We're done. You want to ask her questions? She's still here. Pepper, where are you? Raise your hand.
I'm here.
Okay, so if people want to ask you questions, you're here. I'm going to give a walking tour in about half an hour, so I'm going to start to get ready. I want to simply mention two things. My birthday bus is next Saturday. Nathan, I'm very excited you and Nicole will be joining us.
We are too.
Okay, it's going to be a lot of fun. And next month, the December Salon will just be devoted to the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis. This is an esoteric school of thought founded by Aleister Crowley in England, and the members of the Star Sapphire Lodge, which is the local branch of the OTO, are going to come in and discuss the fundamentals of the law of thelema, and then they're going to perform a Gnostic Mass. And this is going to consume both presentations. So the introduction will be about half an hour, and the Gnostic Mass, we'll have a break, and then the Gnostic Mass will be about an hour. So, yes, if you haven't gotten a flyer, come take one. Right here. Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Kim, raise your hand. Kim, just say this. Come on.
Hi, Kim.
Hi, welcome. On the back of your flyers is the cover of my forthcoming mystery novel, The Kept Girl. The Kept Girl is the story of Raymond Chandler, a young oil executive who lived a couple of blocks, well, worked a couple of blocks from here. You might have heard of the mystery novels he wrote later, but in the 20s, he was just an oil executive. And I've written a book about how his boss's nephew got taken by a bunch of taxi-dancing, angel-worshipping cultists. This really happened. I was actually going to write a nonfiction book about this, but there's not quite enough information to write nonfiction, so it's become a mystery novel. It's being published on a subscription model, which means if you want to subscribe, you pay a little extra, but you get a special edition, and your name is in the book, and you get to come to a very special event that we're going to be putting on, Subscribers Appreciation Party, which will be sort of like a Lava Literary Salon. So check it out. The book itself will be available for regular purchase as a paperback or ebook around February 1. And there's a website, you can read the first chapter, and it's really a completely demented tale. And I hope that you'll give it a look.
Thank you, Kim. I want to thank everyone. Ask Christina questions, ask Pepper questions. If anyone's here for the walking tour, we'll get started about 2:25, which is probably sooner than I'd like to believe.
And people can come to the walking tour if they want to.
Yeah, everyone here who wants, okay, you should come on, everyone here should come on the walking tour. The walking tour, I think I mentioned at the beginning, the walking tour, we're going to walk up a couple blocks to the Bradbury building. Is Suzanne here? I thought I saw her. She wandered off. All right, Suzanne Lummis is going to do a presentation with some other poets called Poem Noir. And it's just going to be a celebration of film noir and poetry and Angel's Flight in the Bradbury building. It'll take about 90 minutes. And Gordon, you're going to read something about Old Bunker Hill at the base of Angel's Flight. So just stick around and come on this walking tour. It'll be a lot of fun. And everyone, thank you so much.